The cursed town of Centralia. I'll never forget the first time I laid eyes on Centralia. The sky was a hazy, dull gray, and the air had a strange, bitter tang to it, like something was burning, but not quite. My breath caught in my throat as I drove down the winding road leading into town, thick plumes of smoke rising from cracks in the ground. It didn't take long to see why people called it a ghost town. Everything felt wrong. There were no birds, no animals, not even the wind to stir the overgrown grass. Just the constant eerie hiss of steam escaping from the earth below. Buildings stood like decaying skeletons, their windows dark and lifeless. The roads, once a grid of a thriving town, were now broken and twisted, riddled with fractures that looked like open wounds on the skin of the earth. The fire beneath Centralia had been burning for over 60 years. But the deeper I went into town, the more I felt like the fire wasn't just an accident. No, there was something else, something malevolent, still alive in those tunnels. I had come to Centralia to explore the ruins for my next documentary. I was drawn to the town's strange history, the fire that never stopped, the mass exodus of residents, the government's attempts to erase it from the map. But as I wandered through the streets with my camera, a gnawing feeling crept into my gut. It felt like I wasn't alone, like unseen eyes were watching me from the shadows. I shrugged it off. Ghost stories and urban legends were common around places like this. But I was here to find the truth, not chase after phantoms. Or so I thought. It wasn't until I reached the old church on the outskirts of town that I began to question everything. The church was one of the few buildings still standing, though it looked as if it hadn't been touched in years. The door hung ajar, and the faint scent of rot wafted out from inside. I hesitated, but something about the place pulled me in. Maybe it was the symbol carved into the stone above the door. Something ancient. Something that didn't belong in a church. I didn't recognize it, but it felt familiar. Like I'd seen it before in a nightmare I couldn't quite remember. As I stepped inside, the floor creaked beneath my feet, and I had to squint to see through the thick, stale air. Dust hung in the beams of sunlight filtering through shattered stained glass windows, and the altar at the front of the room was draped in cobwebs. But it wasn't the decay that made my skin crawl. It was the sense that something was lurking in the darkness beyond the light. I scanned the room with my flashlight, but the beam barely cut through the gloom. I tried to steady my breathing as I moved forward, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. Then, suddenly there was a sound. Soft at first, like the whisper of wind through the trees, but it grew louder, closer. It was a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the walls. I froze. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as the growling intensified, now joined by a faint shuffling sound, like something dragging itself across the floor. My pulse pounded in my ears as I slowly turned toward the source of the noise, but there was nothing. Just the darkened hallway leading deeper into the church. I should have left. Every instinct screamed at me to get out of there, but I couldn't. Something had taken hold of me, something beyond fear. A morbid curiosity that pulled me forward. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the shadows growing thicker with every step. The growling became more defined, more real, and the air grew colder, stifling. As I reached the end of the hallway, a sudden deafening bang shattered the silence. I whipped around, my heart in my throat, but again there was nothing. Just the hollow, empty corridor behind me. That's when I saw it. A figure, barely visible in the darkness, crouched at the far end of the hallway. It was twisted and gaunt, its skin pale and sickly, with hollow eyes that gleamed faintly in the dim light. Its mouth hung open, and I could see rows of sharp, jagged teeth glistening as it let out another low growl. I stumbled back, but my legs felt heavy, like they were sinking into the floor. The figure crawled toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural, like it was fighting against some unseen force. The stench of sulfur filled the air as it got closer, and I could see the flesh on its hands was blackened and charred, as if it had been burned alive. I bolted. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air, my heart slamming against my ribs. The sky had darkened even more, and the smoke from the ground seemed thicker, more oppressive. It wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket, and I could feel the heat rising from the earth beneath my feet. I fumbled with my camera, desperate to get footage of the thing I'd seen. But when I turned back toward the church, the door was closed. The building stood silent, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. I wasn't imagining it. And I wasn't alone. I glanced at the ground and saw something strange. A small blackened handprint in the dirt, like the ones I'd seen on that creature's burned skin. I knelt down to examine it, but as I reached out, the ground shifted beneath me. I jumped back just in time to see a crack split open where the handprint had been. Smoke and ash billowing out from the depths below. And then I heard it again, faint but unmistakable. The growl. It was coming from the crack in the ground, and it was getting louder. Something was down there, something that wasn't supposed to be. I backed away, but the ground continued to tremble, and more cracks began to form around me. The heat was unbearable now, and the air was thick with smoke. I turned and ran, but no matter how far I got from the church, the growling followed me, echoing through the empty streets of Centralia. By the time I reached my car, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. I sped out of town, not daring to look back. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. Something that was still watching, waiting. I thought I could escape Centralia, but whatever was down there, it wasn't done with me yet. And deep down, I knew I would have to go back. I spent weeks trying to forget what happened in Centralia. I told myself it was just my imagination. Stress, fatigue, the isolation playing tricks on me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the images from my mind. That figure, its blackened hands, the growl echoing through the tunnels beneath the town. It was all too real. The footage I had shot was useless. Nothing but static and strange distortions. My camera had failed me when I needed it most, leaving me with nothing to prove what I'd seen. But the blackened handprint, the cracks in the earth, the oppressive heat. I couldn't just let it go. Something was down there, something ancient and evil. I knew it, and it knew me. It started with the dreams. Every night, I'd find myself back in Centralia, standing in front of that church. The door would creak open, and I'd feel that pull again. The same morbid curiosity that had driven me inside the first time. But in the dreams, I wouldn't turn away. I'd step inside, deeper into the darkness, the growling growing louder, closer. And just before I'd wake up, I'd see it, the creature crawling toward me, its hollow eyes fixed on mine. The dreams were bad enough, but then things started happening in my waking life. It began with small, almost imperceptible changes. Shadows seemed darker, stretching unnaturally across the walls of my apartment. Strange noises echoed through the halls at night. Soft whispers, the creak of floorboards, the distant sound of something dragging itself across the ground. But the worst was the smell. That stench of sulfur, the same one I'd smelled in Centralia, began to linger in the air. It didn't matter how many times I cleaned, how many windows I opened. The smell wouldn't go away. It was always there, hanging in the background. A constant reminder of what I'd left behind. I tried to ignore it. I tried to move on with my life. But every day I felt it getting closer. That presence, whatever it was, creeping into my world. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus, couldn't think about anything but Centralia. And I knew deep down that there was only one way to stop it. I had to go back. It took everything I had to convince myself to return to that cursed town. I packed my bags, grabbed a new camera, and drove through the night. By the time I reached Centralia, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. The town was as desolate as I remembered, but this time, it felt different. The air was thicker, the smoke darker, and the silence oppressive. I parked at the edge of town and made my way to the church, my heart pounding in my chest. The closer I got, the stronger the stench of sulfur became, burning my throat and making my eyes water. But I pressed on, determined to find answers, to confront whatever was lurking beneath the surface. The church door was still closed, just as it had been when I left. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the handle. But the dream, the pull, was too strong. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was colder this time, the shadows deeper. The hallway stretched out before me, and that low growl echoed from somewhere within the darkness. My flashlight flickered as I moved forward, the beam barely cutting through the gloom. The walls seemed to close in around me, the ceiling lower than before, the floor creaking under my weight. Then, halfway down the hall, I noticed something strange. A set of footprints in the dust. They were small, child-sized, and they led deeper into the church, disappearing into the blackness beyond. My stomach churned, but I followed them, my heart racing with every step. The growling grew louder, more insistent, and the air grew colder, biting at my skin. I rounded a corner and froze. There, in the center of the room, stood a child, a girl no more than 8 or 9 years old. She was dressed in a tattered white dress, her hair matted and filthy, her skin pale as bone. She stood perfectly still, her back to me, her head slightly tilted to one side as if listening to something I couldn't hear. "Hey," I called out, my voice trembling. "Are you okay?" She didn't respond. She didn't move. She just stood there, silent and still, her head tilted, her hands hanging limply at her sides. I took a step closer, my hands shaking. "Do you need help?" Still nothing. Just silence. And then slowly she began to turn. My breath caught in my throat as I saw her face. It was wrong. Her eyes were wide, but there was nothing behind them. Just empty black voids. Her mouth hung open in a silent scream, her lips cracked and bleeding. But it was her skin that terrified me most. It was charred, burned, just like the figure I'd seen in the hallway before. Blackened and blistered, like she had been dragged from the flames of hell itself. She took a step toward me, her movements jerky and unnatural, just like the creature I'd seen before. The growling intensified, echoing all around me, and I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet as I tried to get away. The girl's head twitched violently, and she let out a sound, a high-pitched, inhuman screech that rattled my bones. I scrambled to my feet and ran, the screeching growing louder behind me. I could hear her footsteps, quick and erratic, as she chased me through the hallways. The church seemed to twist and warp around me, the walls closing in, the floor shifting beneath my feet. I burst through the front doors and into the open air, gasping for breath. The smoke was thicker now, the heat more intense. The ground trembled beneath me, and I could see cracks forming, spreading like a spider's web across the earth. I ran to my car, but when I reached it, I froze. The blackened handprints. They were all over the car, smeared across the windows, the doors, the hood. I hesitated for just a moment, and that was all it took. The ground split open beneath me, a gaping maw of fire and smoke. I barely had time to scream before I was swallowed whole, and as the darkness closed in around me, I realized I had been wrong. Centralia wasn't just cursed. It wasn't just haunted. It was alive. I awoke in complete darkness, the suffocating smell of sulfur burning my lungs. My body ached, my head throbbed, and I had no idea how long I had been out. I tried to move, but the ground beneath me was unstable, shifting like sand. Panic surged through me as I felt the oppressive heat rising from below. I was underground. I scrambled to my feet, my fingers clawing at the dirt walls around me. A faint glow flickered in the distance, casting eerie shadows on the tunnel walls. The air was thick with smoke and ash, and every breath felt like swallowing embers. My heart pounded as I realized where I was. I had fallen into the tunnels, the burning veins that stretched beneath Centralia, the ones that had been smoldering for decades. But this wasn't just an underground coal fire. I could feel it. Something malevolent, something ancient, was pulsing through the very walls of this place, feeding off the fire, off the fear. A faint, almost rhythmic sound echoed through the tunnel, like distant chanting. I couldn't make out the words, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. The voices seemed to rise and fall, blending with the growling that had haunted me since I arrived. I had to get out, now. I stumbled forward, following the faint glow ahead. The tunnel twisted and turned, narrowing in places until I had to crawl on my hands and knees. The heat intensified the deeper I went, and the ground trembled with every step. The chanting grew louder, more distinct, and I began to hear whispers. Soft, hissing voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "You shouldn't have come back." The whisper was right by my ear. I spun around, but no one was there. Just the endless darkness, the smoke swirling around me. I quickened my pace, desperate to escape, but no matter how fast I moved, the voices followed, growing louder, more insistent. "Leave before it's too late." I rounded a corner and came face to face with something that nearly stopped my heart. A door. It was old, ancient even, made of dark wood with iron bands that were rusted and decaying. It didn't belong here, not in these burning tunnels. The door was out of place, an anachronism in the heart of this hellish landscape. And yet, it felt significant, as if it held the answers to everything that had happened in Centralia. The voices grew louder, urging me to turn back, but I couldn't. I had come too far, seen too much. Whatever was behind that door, I needed to know. With trembling hands, I reached for the iron handle. The metal was hot to the touch, burning my skin, but I didn't let go. I pulled the door open, the heavy wood creaking on its hinges, and stepped inside. The room beyond was unlike anything I had ever seen. It was a vast chamber, dimly lit by the glow of the burning coal below. The walls were lined with strange symbols, carved deep into the stone, and at the center of the room stood a massive altar made of blackened rock. The air was thick with the scent of blood and ash, and I could feel the ground pulsing beneath my feet, as if the very earth was alive. And then I saw them. Figures, cloaked in shadow, standing in a circle around the altar. Their faces were hidden, but their presence was overwhelming, oppressive. They were chanting in a language I didn't understand, their voices low and rhythmic, rising and falling in unison. I could feel the power radiating from them, ancient and dark, and it took everything I had not to turn and run. But my eyes were drawn to the altar, to what lay upon it. A body! No, not just a body, a corpse. It was burned beyond recognition, its flesh blackened and cracked. But I could see that it had once been human. The smell of charred meat filled the air, making me gag, but I couldn't look away. The corpse's eyes were wide open, staring up at the ceiling with a look of sheer terror frozen on its face. One of the figures stepped forward, and as they did, the chanting stopped. The silence was deafening, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. The figure raised their hand, and I saw it. The same blackened, charred skin that I had seen on the creature in the church, on the girl in the hallway. This wasn't just a curse. This was a ritual, a sacrifice. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was rooted to the spot. The figure reached out, placing their hand on the corpse, and in that moment, I understood. The fire beneath Centralia wasn't an accident. It was a prison, a seal that had been placed over something far more dangerous, far more evil than anyone could have imagined. The fire had been burning for decades, but it wasn't just consuming coal. It was consuming the curse, keeping whatever was beneath the town contained. But now the seal was breaking. The rituals were weakening the fire's hold, allowing the darkness to spread, to grow stronger. And I'd been lured here. I was part of it now. The figure turned to me, their hollow eyes gleaming in the dim light. They didn't speak, but I could hear the message clearly in my mind. Asterisk, asterisk, you are the next sacrifice. Asterisk, asterisk. Panic surged through me, and I turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind me. The ground trembled violently, and I could feel the heat rising, the flames licking at my heels. The chanting resumed, louder now, more intense, and I could feel the darkness closing in around me. I ran, stumbling through the tunnels, the walls closing in, the voices growing louder, more frantic. The heat was unbearable, and I could feel my skin blistering, burning as I pushed forward. The ground split open beneath me, fiery cracks spreading in all directions, but I couldn't stop. I had to escape. I had to get out. And then, just as I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw it. A light, faint and flickering, but real. I sprinted toward it, my lungs burning, my vision blurring, and I burst through the tunnel's exit, collapsing onto the scorched earth outside. I gasped for air, my body trembling, my mind racing. The town was silent again, the smoke rising lazily from the cracks in the ground, but I could feel it. The darkness was still there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting. And I knew with a sickening certainty that it wasn't over. Not yet. Because I hadn't escaped. I had only just begun to uncover the truth. The air outside Centralia felt different, but not in a good way. It was heavy, thick with the weight of what I had seen and what I knew was still lurking beneath the surface. I wanted to believe I was safe now, that I had outrun whatever evil haunted that town, but deep down I knew the truth. It had followed me. For days after escaping the tunnels, I tried to resume some semblance of normalcy. I tried to convince myself that it was over, that I had survived, but the signs were everywhere. The strange shadows, the cold spots in my apartment, the sulfuric stench that seemed to cling to me no matter where I went. And then there were the dreams. Horrible, vivid nightmares where I was back in those burning tunnels, the walls closing in, the figures surrounding me. Every night I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, only to hear the faintest sound of something moving in the darkness of my room. I wasn't alone. I knew I had to go back to Centralia one last time, to confront whatever I had unleashed. The town had drawn me in from the beginning, and it wouldn't let go until it had claimed what it wanted. I packed my things, leaving behind a hastily written note to anyone who might wonder where I'd gone. I drove through the night, the road to Centralia winding through thick forest and desolate landscapes. The closer I got, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Like the town itself was a living thing, waiting for me. By the time I arrived, the first light of dawn was just starting to creep over the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the empty streets. I parked at the edge of town, the same spot as before, and stared at the ruins of Centralia. The smoke was thicker now, the cracks in the ground wider. The air hummed with a low, ominous vibration, and I knew there was no turning back. I made my way through the streets, retracing my steps to the church. But as I approached, something was different. The ground beneath me trembled, and the air was filled with a distant rumbling sound, like thunder rolling through the earth. And then I saw it, a figure standing at the entrance of the church. It was the girl, the one I had seen inside the tunnels. But this time she wasn't moving. She just stood there, her hollow eyes locked on mine, her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. The sight of her sent a wave of nausea through me, but I forced myself to keep walking, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached the church, she slowly turned and walked inside. I followed her, my steps heavy with dread. The interior was even darker than before, the shadows deeper, the air colder. The door creaked shut behind me, and I was plunged into an eerie silence. The girl led me through the twisted hallways, her bare feet barely making a sound on the cracked floor. We descended into the tunnels once more, the heat growing more intense with every step. The walls seemed to pulse, as if the town was alive, breathing, watching. Finally, we reached the chamber, the one with the altar and the dark figures. But this time, the figures weren't just standing in a circle. They were moving, chanting louder, their voices rising to a fever pitch. The air crackled with energy, and the flames below the ground roared like a living beast. At the center of the chamber on the altar was something new. A body. But this time it wasn't just any body. It was me. My own lifeless corpse lay there, burned and blackened, eyes wide open in a frozen scream. The sight of it paralyzed me with fear, my mind unable to comprehend what I was seeing. But the figures kept chanting, their voices growing louder, more insistent, as if they were calling something forth. And then from the darkness of the tunnel it emerged. The creature. It was no longer just a twisted, charred figure. It had grown, its body towering and grotesque, its skin a mass of burned flesh and bone. Hollow eyes gleamed with a malevolent light as it crawled toward me, its mouth hanging open in a silent howl. The figures surrounded me, their chanting reaching a crescendo, and I realized with horror what was happening. The ritual wasn't about releasing something from the town. It was about merging me with it. The curse wasn't just bound to Centralia, it was bound to me. The creature lunged forward, and I tried to run, but the ground beneath me shifted, pulling me toward the altar, toward my own charred corpse. The air was filled with the stench of burning flesh, and I could feel the heat searing my skin. The figures closed in, their hands reaching out, their faces still hidden in shadow. And then, with a sickening jolt, I felt it, a connection, something dark and ancient latching onto my soul, pulling me deeper into the curse. The flames roared higher, the ground trembled, and the creature's hollow eyes bored into mine. I screamed, but no sound came out, and then everything went black. When I woke up, I was standing at the edge of Centralia, just as I had been when I first arrived. The town was silent, the smoke rising lazily from the ground. But something was different. I was different. I looked down at my hands and saw the blackened, charred flesh. The same burns that had marked the creature in the tunnels. The same burns that had marked the girl. I wasn't me anymore. I was Centralia. The town had taken me, consumed me, and now I was part of it. I could feel the fire burning beneath the ground, the ancient curse that pulsed through the earth. The figures, the rituals, they weren't just part of the town's past. They were part of its future. And I was their newest servant. I turned and walked back toward the church, my steps slow and deliberate. The town was alive, and so was I. But not in the way I had once been. I had become something else, something dark and eternal. And as I walked through the streets of Centralia, I knew one thing for certain. No one would ever escape, because Centralia never lets go.